and I live in a small, close-knit town where everyone knows everyone. People here don't just exchange pleasantries, they share everything. For me, the highlight of any week is hosting dinner parties. A good meal, great friends, and lively conversation are all I need to feel complete. But one warm, breezy evening, I hosted a gathering that spiraled into an unforgettable mystery, one that still haunts me to this day. It was the perfect evening to host. Soft golden sunlight spilling through the windows, a breeze carrying the scent of fresh flowers, and the house filled with the delicious smell of roasted lamb and homemade pies. I'd spent all day preparing, making sure everything was just right. My closest friends, Emily, Ryan, Grace, and Peter, were coming, and I'd invited a new neighbor, Leo, who had just moved into town. He was a quiet guy, a bit of a mystery, but I thought it would be nice to include him. Maybe he'd feel more at home. The evening began like any other. We sat around the table, laughing, reminiscing about old times, and digging into my cooking. The food was a hit, and the conversation flowed easily, with everyone enjoying the company. After dessert, we all moved to the living room, where we continued chatting. But that's when I noticed Leo seemed off. He'd been unusually quiet all night, but now he looked uneasy. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe he was just shy, or maybe the conversation didn't interest him. But as the evening wore on, his mood seemed to shift even further. He became restless, barely speaking, avoiding eye contact. It wasn't like the Leo I'd met earlier. Something was wrong. Finally, out of nowhere, Leo stood up. He mumbled something under his breath about needing to get some air, and before I could respond, he was out of the door. The loud slam of it behind him left us all in stunned silence. We sat there for a few minutes, confused. We tried to brush it off, but the mood had undeniably shifted. After some awkward goodbyes, everyone left, still puzzled by Leo's abrupt departure. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. I decided to go check on him. His car was parked in the driveway, but when I knocked, there was no answer. I thought maybe he just needed some space, so I left. But after a couple of days without hearing from him, I got worried. I reached out to my friends. None of them had seen him either. It was as if he had disappeared off the face of the earth. Concerned, I called the police and reported him missing. They took my statement, but assured me they'd handle it. Days turned into weeks, and nothing. No one had seen Leo since that night. One evening, unable to let it go, I found myself retracing the events of that night in my mind, wondering if I'd missed a sign or if there was something more I could have done. That's when I decided to dig into Leo's past. What I found was chilling. He had moved here after a nasty breakup, trying to escape the shadows of his past. He hadn't made many friends and had no family nearby. The more I looked, the more I realized I knew nothing about him, really. Then things started to get strange. Late one night, while I was alone in the house, I heard faint rustling outside. Soft, deliberate movements like someone was lingering just out of sight. My heart pounded in my chest. I peered out the window but saw nothing. I convinced myself it was nothing. A raccoon, maybe. But the next night, the noises were back. Footsteps, whispers, and the unmistakable feeling of being watched. Sleep became a stranger to me. I felt like someone was always near, but just out of reach. In a moment of desperation, I searched through Leo's house again, this time discovering something I hadn't seen before, an old notebook. The pages were filled with fragmented thoughts, revealing his troubled state of mind. He wrote about feeling like an outsider, about a growing sense of paranoia, and most disturbingly about something or someone he feared was watching him. The last entry was dated the very night of the dinner party. It read, "I can't escape. It's always watching. I have to leave. It's too late." Chills ran down my spine. I gave the journal to the police, but it only deepened the mystery. They searched his house, his neighborhood, and even questioned the locals. But Leo had vanished without a trace, and all we had left were questions. My friends tried to comfort me, but I couldn't let it go. It felt like there was something I was missing, something we all had overlooked. Weeks turned into months. My friends moved on, but I couldn't. I kept replaying that night in my head. Could I have prevented it? Had I missed the signs? The weight of it all was too much. One night, while I was out for a walk, I caught a glimpse of something, faint shadows moving near the edge of the woods, where no one ever went. My pulse quickened. Was it Leo? Or something else? I've never been able to shake the feeling that Leo's disappearance is tied to something darker, something none of us could see, but that was always there, lurking. I'm still searching for answers, still hoping to understand what happened that night. But deep down, I know that sometimes the more you look, the more you realize there are things in the dark that will never be found. The dinner party that began as a simple gathering of friends had turned into a haunting memory. And no matter how hard I try to forget, the questions remain. What was Leo afraid of? Why did he leave? Where did he go? And most importantly, will I ever find the truth? A few years ago, my son Alex came home late one night, brought back by his friend James. Alex was 20 at the time, and I had just gone to bed when I heard the door creak open. My heart immediately raced. I quickly got up to investigate. As I reached the living room, I saw James struggling to hold Alex up. My son could barely stand on his own. His clothes were a mess. His eyes were barely open, and he was swaying. "Sorry about this," James said, his voice calm, as though this wasn't a big deal. Alex had a little too much to drink. I nodded, trying not to show my concern. "Let's get him to his room," I said. Together we helped Alex upstairs and into his bed. He mumbled incoherently, his head lolling to the side. I pulled off his shoes, tucked him in, and hoped he'd sleep it off. James lingered in the doorway, then looked at me with a small smile. "I'll check on him tomorrow." "Thanks for bringing him home," I said, feeling a little better now that Alex was safe. James turned and left without saying another word. I returned to my room, exhausted, but with the nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right. The next morning, Alex was groggy, but otherwise okay. He had no real memory of the night, other than that he'd had too much to drink with friends. I pushed the strange feeling aside, thinking it was just a typical night out. Then, a year later, everything changed. I was watching the news one evening when a breaking story caught my attention. My heart dropped into my stomach as I listened. A young man had been found dead in a hotel room, and the police were searching for his friend, his so-called good friend, who checked him in the night before. The reporter said they were looking for the suspect, and the sketch they released made my blood run cold. The sketch looked almost exactly like James. I immediately called Alex, telling him to turn on the news. He called back a few minutes later, panic in his voice. "Mom, what do we do?" "I don't know," I replied, feeling paralyzed by the thought. "We need to call the police." We did, and soon detectives were at our house. Alex told them everything he knew, how James had brought him home drunk, how he'd seemed perfectly normal. The detectives listened carefully, but didn't say much. Days turned into weeks, and James had vanished. The more I learned about the case, the more horrifying it became. The truth slowly emerged. James had been involved in the brutal murder of a man. He had gotten his friend drunk, checked him into a hotel, and then left him to die. Alex couldn't believe it. This person he'd trusted, this friend, was capable of something so monstrous. Alex withdrew into himself, barely talking to anyone. I could only watch helplessly. Then one night, Alex broke the silence. He turned to me, his face pale. "Moms, do you think I could have been next?" The question cut through me like a knife. Could I have lost my son that night? Was this the fate James had in mind for him? I didn't have an answer, and that realization filled me with dread. The police eventually tracked James down to a run-down motel in a neighboring state. They arrested him, and the trial that followed was horrific. The details of the murder were almost too much to bear. In the end, James was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. But for Alex and me, life was never the same. The betrayal, the fear, lingered like a shadow. The man who once seemed like a trusted friend had turned into a monster. Even now, years later, the memory of that night haunts us. I still sometimes catch myself wondering, what if James had decided to finish what he started with Alex that night? met an old man at a gas station. What he told me still haunts me. I work the night shift at a gas station in New Hampshire. It's usually pretty quiet. I stock shelves, clean up, handle the register. Simple, right? That is until one night. Everything changed. It was close to midnight when an old car pulled up. Out stepped an elderly man in khakis, a button-down shirt, and white hair. He looked like someone's sweet grandpa, slow and deliberate as he walked inside. I greeted him with a smile, but something about him didn't sit right. "Good evening, sir. How can I help you?" I asked. He didn't respond much, just wandered the store like he had all the time in the world. I went back to my work, wiping down the counter, trying to shake the weird vibe he gave off. A few minutes later, he approached the counter with a bottle of water and a pack of gum. "Will that be all?" I asked, ringing him up. He nodded, but then just as I handed him his change, he gripped my wrist with his cold hand. I froze, staring at him. His eyes were, strange. He leaned in close and whispered, "Hell is a real place, and the devil already has his hand on you, girl. Be careful." I stood there, heart racing, completely speechless. The guy just took his stuff, walked out, and drove away into the night. I tried to shake it off. Maybe he was crazy, right? But that night I couldn't sleep. Every little noise made my heart jump. His words echoed in my head like a nightmare that wouldn't end. What did he mean? Why me? The next few days went by, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. And then it happened. One night, while I was stocking shelves, I heard whispers. At first I thought it was just my imagination, but the whispers kept getting louder. I spun around, but there was no one there. I tried to ignore it, but then the lights flickered. I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I whirled around, and no one was there. Panic hit me. I ran to the front counter, grabbed my phone, and dialed my coworker. No answer. Suddenly the door chimed, and there he was, the old man, standing in the doorway. "Hell is a real place," he said again, his voice sending chills down my spine. "The devil already has his hand on you, girl. Be careful." His cold grip grabbed my wrist again, and I couldn't pull away fast enough. I panicked, stumbling backward. "Be careful," he whispered. Then he just walked out. I was frozen. I ran out of the store, jumped into my car, and drove home faster than I've ever driven before. I didn't stop until I was safely inside my apartment, locked in. That night, I couldn't sleep. The old man's warning haunted me, the whispers, the cold touch. It all felt like something more than just a coincidence. I never went back to that gas station. I couldn't. I still wonder if that old man was just a crazy, harmless old guy, or if something darker was trying to reach me. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that the devil is watching, waiting. The Night We Almost Let a Stranger In by Alex. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway. My family and I, city dwellers always craving a break, decided to rent a secluded farmhouse in the countryside. The listing promised everything: charm, space, and even a pool. It seemed perfect, an escape from our busy lives. We arrived on a sunny Friday afternoon, eager to get away from the concrete jungle. My wife, Emma, and our two kids, Noah and Lily, couldn't wait to dive in and explore. The farmhouse was nestled at the end of a long, winding gravel road, surrounded by towering trees. The porch creaked with history, the house full of vintage furniture and old portraits that made it feel like we'd stepped back in time. After unpacking, we headed straight for the pool. The kids splashed around happily while Emma and I kicked back, dipping our feet in the cool water. The air was fresh, and the only sounds were the laughter of our kids and the soft rustling of leaves. It felt like a scene from a movie, a perfect night under the stars. But then I heard it. A soft crunching sound, like someone walking on dry leaves. I glanced around, but there was nothing but darkness beyond the glow of our pool lights. Emma noticed my gaze. "Did you hear that?" I asked. "It's probably just an animal," she reassured me. But something about it didn't sit right. The noise kept coming, and it was getting closer. I told the kids to get out of the pool, my nerves starting to fray. We quickly packed up and retreated inside, locking the door behind us. The house, once so charming, now felt eerily unfamiliar. I checked every window and door, double-checking that everything was locked. We tucked the kids into bed, and I kept my phone's flashlight nearby, just in case. Time dragged on, the house grew quiet, and I thought maybe I was just being paranoid. That's when the knock came. It was loud, stern. I froze. I grabbed the flashlight and peered through the peephole. A man stood outside, wearing what looked like a police uniform. "Open up, it's the police," he said. His voice was calm, but something about it felt wrong. I hesitated. Why was a cop showing up at our farmhouse so late at night? I called out through the door. "Why are you here?" "There's been a report of suspicious activity. Please open the door," he replied. My gut screamed that something wasn't right. I turned to Emma, and in a low voice I said, "I'm calling the police." While I dialed, the man outside knocked harder. "Open up now," he shouted, his calm voice now tinged with frustration. I quickly spoke to the dispatcher, explaining the situation. That's when I learned the terrifying truth. No officers had been dispatched to our location. They told me to stay inside and lock everything up. Real officers were on their way. Panic settled in my chest as the fake officer kept banging on the door and trying the handle. He was getting more persistent. I ordered Emma and the kids into a bedroom to hide. Then I snuck to the living room, turning off all the lights, praying the shadows would keep us hidden. The knocking continued. Then to my horror, I heard him banging on the windows, trying to find another way in. My heart raced as I held my breath, hoping the glass wouldn't break. Minutes felt like hours. The tension was unbearable. Finally, the flashing lights of a police car lit up the driveway. I breathed a sigh of relief. The imposters scattered into the woods as the real officers approached, checking the property for signs of anyone else. They didn't find the man who had been knocking, but they did confirm the truth. Sometimes criminals pose as police officers to gain entry into homes. They warned us it was a rare tactic, but a dangerous one. I felt a shiver run down my spine. What would have happened if we had opened that door? The officers suggested we find somewhere else to stay for the night, and we packed up in a hurry. The kids were scared, and Emma and I were shaken, but we were thankful we were all safe. We spent the rest of the night at a nearby hotel, but my mind kept racing. I couldn't stop thinking about what could have happened. That experience changed everything about how I approached safety, especially when renting places in unfamiliar areas. It's easy to feel safe when everything seems perfect, but trust your instincts. Always verify, always check, and never let your guard down, no matter how idyllic the place may seem. It was 2016 when I had an experience that still haunts me. After a long, draining week of work, I was exhausted and decided to hit the sack early on a Saturday night. I lived in a small one-bedroom apartment, and it was quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerator. I crawled into bed around 9 p.m., pulled the covers up, and soon drifted into a deep sleep. But my sleep wasn't peaceful. My dreams were strange, vivid, and unsettling. I couldn't wake up, couldn't move or open my eyes. It felt like I was trapped in my own body. When I finally woke up, I noticed it was still dark outside. I reached for my phone on the nightstand to check the time. It was 3:33 a.m. I rubbed my eyes, still groggy, and sat up in bed. That's when I saw something that made my heart race. An extra bed sitting in the corner of my room right next to mine. I was certain it wasn't there before. My apartment was small. There was no room for another bed. My mind scrambled to understand, blinking several times, hoping it was just a trick of my tired eyes. But no, there it was, identical to mine, with white sheets and a dark wooden frame. And there was someone lying under those sheets, perfectly still. My heart pounded. Who was this? No one else had a key to my apartment, and I hadn't invited anyone over. My throat went dry. I wanted to scream, but couldn't make a sound. Fear gripped me as I slowly slid out of bed, trying to make as little noise as possible. I reached for the light switch, but my hands were shaking so much I missed it the first time. Finally, I turned on the light. The figure still didn't move. I could see the sheet clearly now. It looked old, worn, and stained in places. I took a deep breath and cautiously walked toward the bed, never taking my eyes off the figure. As I got closer, the sheet was thin, almost transparent, and I could make out the shape of a body under it, but their face was still hidden. My hand shook as I reached out to touch the sheet. Just as my fingers brushed the fabric, the figure moved. I froze in terror. The figure slowly sat up, the sheet still covering them. They turned their head toward me, and though I couldn't see their face, I felt the weight of their stare. The figure stood up, still wrapped in the sheet. They were taller than anyone I knew. They took a slow step toward me. I could barely whisper, "Who are you?" The figure didn't respond. They just stood there, watching me. I backed away, my mind racing. I had to get out of there. I turned and ran toward the door, fumbling with the lock. I could hear the figure's footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate. Finally, I managed to unlock the door and bolted out into the hallway, slamming the door behind me. I didn't stop running until I was outside, the cool night air hitting my face. I leaned against the building, trying to catch my breath. My mind was spinning. Who was that? How had they gotten into my apartment? I couldn't go back inside alone. I called the police. When the officers arrived, I explained what had happened. They looked at me with concern, but told me to wait outside while they checked the apartment. I paced the parking lot, my heart still racing. After what felt like an eternity, the officers returned. "There's no one in there," one said. "We checked every room. Are you sure you weren't dreaming?" I wanted to argue. I knew what I had seen, but I didn't. I thanked the officers and watched them drive off. Still shaken, I stood there, staring up at my apartment window, wondering what the hell had just happened. With no other choice, I finally went back inside. The extra bed was gone. Everything was exactly as it had been before I went to sleep. I checked all the windows and doors. They were all locked. A cold chill ran down my spine as I realized that whoever or whatever had been in my room had vanished without a trace. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat on the couch with all the lights on, too rattled to even close my eyes. I couldn't explain what had happened. I moved to a new apartment shortly after, hoping the memory would fade. But some nights, when I'm lying in bed, I still feel like someone is watching me. I can't help but wonder if that figure in the white sheet will ever return. When I was younger, there was nothing more exciting to me than exploring abandoned places. The mystery of old, empty buildings always called to me. The idea that these spaces, once full of life, now stood silent and forgotten, fascinated me. I loved stepping into the past, seeing the decay of what was once new, and feeling the history lingering in the air. A few years ago, my friends and I decided to explore an abandoned school in our town. The building had been empty for years, and countless rumors surrounded it. Some said it was haunted, and we of course wanted to find out for ourselves. It was a perfect night for our adventure. We met at my house and packed flashlights, snacks, and our phones. There were 4 of us, me, Tom, Lisa, and Sarah. We were all excited, but there was also a lingering sense of fear that made our hearts race as we walked toward the school. Along the way, we talked about the stories we'd heard. Some people said they had heard strange noises inside, while others claimed to have seen shadows moving in the windows at night. When we reached the school, it looked even creepier than we had imagined. The windows were broken, the doors were boarded up, and vines had overtaken the walls. The paint was peeling, and the entire place had a decaying, forgotten feel. It looked like it belonged in a horror movie. We found an entry point through a broken window at the back. One by one, we climbed through, trying to be as quiet as possible. Once inside, we flicked on our flashlights. The beams sliced through the darkness, revealing dusty hallways and old lockers. The air smelled thick with mold and decay. We stuck close together, not wanting to get lost in the maze of corridors. As we walked, our footsteps echoed loudly in the silence. Every sound felt amplified in the empty building, and the quiet was almost oppressive. We started by exploring the main hallway where the principal's office was. The door was slightly ajar, and we cautiously pushed it open. Inside, the room was a mess. Papers scattered everywhere, the desk overturned. It looked as if someone had left in a hurry. I couldn't shake the eerie thought of what could have caused such chaos. Next, we moved to the classrooms. Each one was filled with old desks and chairs, some broken, others covered in dust. Books were left open on the desks, their pages yellowed with age. It felt like the students had just walked out and never returned. In one classroom, we found a chalkboard with strange, smudged writing. The words were hard to read, but it looked like some kind of warning. Tom, ever the brave one, laughed it off and said it was probably just a prank. But I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling it gave me. As we continued exploring, we heard a loud bang coming from somewhere deeper in the building. We froze, our hearts pounding. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered. We nodded, eyes wide with fear. Despite the rising panic, we decided to investigate. Every instinct screamed at us to leave, but curiosity kept us moving. We followed the noise down a long, dark hallway, the walls lined with old photographs of students and teachers, their smiling faces feeling eerie as if they were watching us. At the end of the hallway, we reached the gymnasium. The doors were closed, but we could hear strange noises coming from inside. With a deep breath, Tom pushed the doors open. The gym was huge, and our flashlights barely illuminated the far corners. The floor creaked beneath our feet as we stepped inside. In the center of the gym stood a figure dressed in old, tattered clothes. It was facing away from us, and its shoulders rose and fell, as if it were breathing heavily. We stood frozen, too scared to move. Then, without warning, the figure turned around. And that's when we saw its face. It was pale and gaunt, with dark, sunken eyes. It stared at us for a moment before letting out a blood-curdling scream that echoed through the gym. I don't remember how we got out of that gym or the building. All I remember is the pure terror that fueled our flight. We didn't stop running until we were far away from the school, breathless and shaking. We never went back. The experience haunted us for months, and none of us could explain what we had seen that night. Our passion for exploring abandoned places faded, replaced by the fear of what we might encounter. That night taught us a lesson. Some places are better left undisturbed. The abandoned school still stands to this day, a silent monument to the horrors that can lurk in the dark. And I, for one, am happy to leave it that way.